Still a few people arriving, but I'll start talking because we're going to run out of time. There's quite a bit to talk about tonight. Very interesting topic. Welcome to a night at the John Oxley Library. I'm Ian Townsend and I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National. I've been a research fellow here at the John Oxley. I've written a couple of novels on two historical aspects of Queensland. Tonight, in the spirit of the centenary of the First World War, we're looking at the medical front. And this is an interesting topic for me because in my research in various aspects of Queensland history over the years, I've bumped into some of the medicos we're going to find out a bit more about tonight. In all the terrible conflicts of humanity, we at least hope to learn something, I think. And the First World War, I believe, was an education for the doctors from Queensland, if nothing else. We had some terrific doctors go to war and they came back, those who survived, with new techniques and experience that were an asset to Queensland. So we're joined by two distinguished men. Their CVs are so long, we could spend the next hour just describing what they've been doing, but Dr. Robert Likeman, Colonel, retired, was the most recent Director of Army Health in Canberra. He originally studied classics and Oriental languages at Oxford and came out as a 10-pound pom in the 1970s and specialised in obstetrics and gynaecology. He served in the General Reserve of the military and then in the regular army. He was in Rwanda and East Timor. He established the Soldier Recovery Centre at Laverack Barracks and has written 7 books, 6 of which are on military history and biography. Dr. John Pearn is a renowned Brisbane paediatrician and holds the rank of Major General. He's a former Surgeon General of the Australian Defence Force and his work with the military has taken him to Vietnam and Rwanda. John spent time in the Arctic conducting survival research for the military. He's had a lot to do over the years with the School of Medicine at the University of Queensland. He's a member of the Order of Australia and a Queenslander of the Year. He's the author of 15 books, is that right? And 30 book chapters involving medicine, biography and military history. And he founded the Australian Society of the History of Medicine. So I've actually left out an awful lot about these two chaps, but I think you get the picture. They've done some remarkable things in a number of fields, which is almost this pertinent to what we're talking about tonight. Before we do talk about the war, I am curious about that. Many of the Queensland medical officers who served in the First World War had multiple skills, like these two gentlemen. They juggled studies in fields that at first glance don't seem related. Robert Likeman, you went from Oriental languages to obstetrics and then medicine in the military. How did that evolve?
Well, Ian, I think we should talk about the doctors from Queensland rather than telling you my life story.
Well, the doctors from Queensland, what sort of struck me about the two of you was these diverse interests, and many of the doctors from Queensland who went overseas had interests in medicine, but also in science.
Well, I think all I can say is that every field of study that you embark on opens up doors and opportunities for other fields, and there really is no end to it. I mean, there's certainly no end to the study of medicine. And I found, for example, when I was writing my various books, I started with the regimental history of the 9th Field Ambulance, and in the course of that I came across Lachlan Wilson. Lachlan Wilson was a Brisbane solicitor, previously in Townsville. He was the light horse, light horse general who captured Damascus from the Turks. Now, you may believe that Lawrence of Arabia captured Damascus from the Turks, but it ain't so. It was a Queenslander. In fact, he was known after the war as the least known famous man in Queensland because he was such a modest character. Anyway, he went to Gallipoli with the 5th Light Horse Regiment, and they had a medical officer with that particular regiment called S.B. Dodds, Dodds with one D, and that rather intrigued me, as did the use of S.B. as as a first name. I mean, it's a well-known Scottish surname.
ESPIE.
ESPIE, yes. And I made a few inquiries, and somebody told me there was an S.B. Dodds in Sydney who was an architect, a very famous architect, and I tracked him down, and indeed he was grandson of Joseph S.B. Dodds. And Joseph S.B. Dodds was a half-brother of the Marx brothers, of whom we're going to hear a lot later on. He was the government medical officer in Brisbane here for 30 years. Very remarkable man. He was president of the Queensland Club for 4 consecutive years, which is a record that no one has ever surpassed. The only person who equalled it was William Glasgow. And as often happens in these situations, I became sort of involved almost like a member of the family, and I ended up writing the biography of S.B. Dodds. So he was at Gallipoli. So there's 2 of them at Gallipoli, but they were also contemporaries at Brisbane Grammar School, which is another dimension that cuts across so many of the people who appear in those pages. They were at school together, and this isn't only true of Brisbane, of course, it's true of Australia generally. Many of the young men who went to war in 1914 had been at school together.
Well, Dr. John Pearn, some of the characters, as Robert mentioned there, most of the Queensland doctors would have known each other if they weren't related to each other in the Marx family. A lot of them went to Gallipoli. Who were some of the characters that stand out in that initially in the war?
Well, I think the enthusiasm to enlist and serve is very much determined by local stories, by local fashion, by local role models. And if we look at military medicine in perspective, for example, Queensland and South Australia particularly have stood out just because, in many ways, of an accident of local tradition. People talk, senior doctors teaching junior doctors the craft and the skills of their profession. If they themselves had seen operational service, that of necessity influences those who are coming on.
So there was a culture.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, Queensland had a very strong military medicine culture prior to Federation. All the settlements in the non-metropolitan areas of Queensland had very strong militia medical service in Ipswich, in Butterberg, Rockhampton, Townsville. All had, from the 1860s, 1870s, had a very strong tradition of volunteering by the local medicos. That's been a tradition here, and I think it's reflected in the centenary this year of the onset of the First World War, where we saw again a rising up and a stepping forward for service when it was needed.
Where did that leave Queensland for doctors? How many had joined up?
Well, it's a big problem actually. This the point that you're making, and is a very important point. Today, we have in the Australian Defence Force almost no full-time specialists. When Australia politically decides to go to war or sends an operational group overseas, our national policy is that it only does so with absolutely certain integrated medical support or supply chains of medical support from our allies with whom we're serving. This means that reservists, men and women who today are serving in many of the hotspots of the world in which Australia has an interest and a commitment, they have to be backfilled because they're reservists, and that had to occur also in the First World War.
Well, many of the doctors who went over, I'm not sure whether this is just something I've noticed, but a lot of them were paediatricians. And so we have, was Kroll, David Gifford Kroll? Yes. And so we had Alfred Jeffress Turner.
Yes. Sydney Fancourt MacDonald. There are 20 or 30 doctors who identified as paediatricians before the specialty which we would define it today. But never those identified as paediatricians who served in the first 20 years of after Federation. One of the most significant ones, I think, was Lillian Violet Cooper. The first Australian woman doctor wasn't commissioned until 1940, and she was only given the honorary rank of captain, and only because she was titled and a widow. But Lillian Violet Cooper, who was the first woman surgeon to be so designated in Australia, and I'm very proud to say, coming from the Royal Children's Hospital in Brisbane, in 1894, she was the first woman doctor to be appointed to any hospital position in Australia. Such was the prejudice against women at that time. And of course, she volunteered for service in the First World War, but that was unthinkable in the social milieu of the time. So she went herself with the Scottish Women's Hospital and served in Serbia in the front line there as Australia's first woman surgeon. She lived in the mansions here in George Street. Her restored heritage building, of course, is very much there, and we're very proud of her service.
Well, in the First World War, Eleanor Elizabeth Byrne, and the papers are over there as well, decided to pay her own way to England and served there, excuse me, in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Do we know much about Eleanor? I don't know much about her myself.
Well, she's a very famous paediatrician in Queensland. She's particularly famous for those who are interested in education, because she is the only woman, or only then young girl, to be enrolled at the all-boys Brisbane Grammar School. And she topped the year, of course, in the final year. And that's a very nice... she became the school doctor for Queensland, travelled extensively in the period 1911 to 1920 as a school doctor, working particularly in identifying the scourge of trachoma, of which perhaps a quarter of all children in Western Queensland suffered from that very debilitating eye disease and blinding eye disease. And Eleanor Byrne is remembered with great affection and great esteem professionally for her work in establishing the school medical service and for her work in trachoma.
Well, they all have remarkable stories when you look at each individual, don't they? Incredible histories and an amazing range of skills. But look, I guess, Robert, you spoke about S.B. Dodds, and he is an interesting character. He was hit by shrapnel at Gallipoli, attending the wounded. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened with Dodds during the war?
Well, Dodds had served in the South African War, so he was a little bit older than the average, but he went, as I said, to Gallipoli as medical officer for the 5th Light Horse Regiment, and he was wounded. A piece of shrapnel passed through his shoulder. Luckily, didn't cut any vital structures. He was evacuated to Egypt and convalesced there, and then returned to the peninsula. After the end of the Gallipoli campaign, he was transferred to the 1st Division as Deputy Assistant Director of Medical Services, and he was promoted. And he was responsible for the evacuation of casualties of the 1st Division. Now, the principal occasion, of course, when he was involved in this was the Battle of Pozieres, in which the 1st Division suffered something like 6,000 wounded and another 2,500 killed. So he was responsible for organising the evacuation of those 6,000 people. And I think that took a tremendous toll on him. And even though he returned to his job and was a well-known personality, undoubtedly underneath he had been deeply affected by this, and as many of you know, he did in fact commit suicide in 1930 when he was 57. It's a very sad ending for someone who was so well respected. Now, I just happen to have here This is a sort of musical trick, isn't it? Before he went to France, well, before he sailed, a dinner was held by the Morton Regiment here for all those members of the regiment who had volunteered to go overseas. And Espy was one of these, and the dinner was held on the 30th of November 1914. And they presented Espy with this, which is a tobacco pouch. It's got a few dents on it, so obviously it got good service while it was overseas. But this is very nearly 100 years old, and it has his initials engraved on the top with the date 30th of November. Following day, he went to another dinner held by the Police Federation here, because he was, in addition to being the government medical officer, or through being the government medical officer, he was also the police surgeon. And they gave him a testimonial which was printed in full in the newspaper, and they presented him with a purse of sovereigns. Didn't actually say how many were in the purse, but this was a very traditional kind of gift in those days that people would give. So that's Espy's story. And the other thing I must tell you about Espy, which is really quite irrelevant to the war, is that he got the job as government medical officer because the previous government medical officer died from the plague, which he contracted while conducting a post-mortem on someone who died from the plague. Now, you may not be aware of this, but there were outbreaks of plague in Brisbane periodically, not only before the First World War, but even in the early 20s. And the way you dealt with it, of course, was to get rid of the rats. Can I just go back to a point that you mentioned earlier? You were saying about all these doctors going away to Gallipoli. What did that result? It resulted, of course, in a considerable shortage of doctors at home, and we find from time to time hospitals writing to doctors asking them to come home because there was this difficulty of maintaining the services. And in World War II, the director of medical services at the beginning of World War II was one of those doctors who had been to Rabaul on the very first expedition. He was also an obstetrician and gynecologist, but that's by the way. His name was Frederick Arthur Maguire. And Freddie Maguire decided that this situation of the home front being depleted would not happen again. So he persuaded the government to pass a law saying that all qualified doctors during the period of the war would be subject to the direction of labour. Now, I'm not aware of any other profession that has been subject to a direction like that, and it was supported 100% by the British Medical Association, which I thought was pretty remarkable.
And was that put into place?
It was put into place, so it meant that those who were not young enough or fit enough to serve overseas would be expected to go somewhere in Australia where the need was pressing for medical services. Can't imagine that happening today.
Well, and the Dodds was of course related to the Marks family of doctors who depleted Queensland as well in the First World War. Alexander and Ted Marks also served, and over on the tables are some of their photos, letters and diaries. John, the Marks family, and I know there are members of the Marks family here, they've been a feature of Brisbane since 1879 and made quite an impact on medicine, science and the military. And here they are in the First World War winning a number of battle honours as well for their courage. And maybe that's not surprising. The job of doctors on the front line was to save human lives. But quite a few of the doctors did receive DSOs.
Yes, indeed. The Marks family is another example of a dynasty of doctor soldiers in Queensland. Charles Ferdinand Marks Sr. From Ireland, of course, in the 1870s, and then two other Marks Edward Oswald Marks and Alexander Hammett Marks, and then young Charles Ferdinand Marks, who for 14 years was the senior doctor soldier here in Queensland, and it was through his agency that many were recruited in Queensland. He was, as some colleagues here in the room this evening will know, was senior obstetrician here in Brisbane, and Jane, his daughter, and now Jane Hassel and Lloyd are here with us this evening as representing that very proud tradition. But they were certainly awarded many decorations. The senior Marks, like many other doctor soldiers, received a volunteer decoration. It carried the post-nominals VD, which was hastily changed to the efficiency decoration by George V.
Do we know what the circumstances were in which Alex received some of his medals?
No, I don't. Not specifically.
Well, Alex was the Deputy Assistant Director of Medical Services for the 4th Division when Espy was with the 1st Division. And they were decorated about the same time following the actions at Pozieres. Espy had already received the Military Cross for his work at Gallipoli, and I can't give you a figure, but many of the doctors who served in World War I received military crosses, which was given for an act of personal bravery. In most cases, it meant going out and treating casualties under fire at great personal risk.
I was going to say, what would the circumstances be? But of course, you can imagine a doctor on the front line, somebody wounded in the field. There's a training, an obligation there, isn't there, to put your life at risk to save somebody else, perhaps more so amongst doctors, perhaps?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, later in the war, there was a directive from the War Office in London that medical officers should not do this because they were more valuable back in the trench treating lots of casualties than going out, picking up an individual and possibly getting themselves killed in the process.
But was there a, during the battle, was there, did the enemy recognise a doctor or a stretcher bearer and hold fire?
Yes, the Germans were very careful to avoid firing directly on anyone wearing a Red Cross. But as I mentioned when we were discussing this earlier, most of the casualties in World War I were caused by shell fire, which is quite, quite indiscriminate. But the important thing when you are treating casualties, I mean, what is it that people die from mostly on the battlefield? It's blood loss. Therefore, the important thing is to get your medical support as far forward as possible. And that, of course, involves placing yourself at a similar risk to the troops who are actually doing the fighting.
That was demonstrated with Pockley in Rabaul, wasn't it, in that battle, that first battle of the First World War, where Pockley gave his Red Cross armband, I think, to the stretcher bearers to take the wounded man back, and then he became, because he didn't have that recognition, he was shot, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. Last month we have just celebrated, it's not the correct word, but we've paid honour to Lieutenant Pockley, the young Sydney doctor who was the first Australian, perhaps killed in the First World War. He went with the expeditionary force to Rabaul, and the German garrison at Rabaul consisted of 20 or 30 German expatriate officers, plus it's thought about 200 Papua New Guinean local hastily trained militia. And in the Battle of Bitter Parka in September 1914, Pockley went to the aid of one of his colleagues who'd been shot and treated him and sent him back with stretcher bearers who were with their party, and instinctively took off his Red Cross brassard and put it on the stretcher bearer who didn't have one to go back. They went back safely to the shore where the wounded person was subsequently evacuated, but Pockley himself then not identified as a doctor, and the Germans always scrupulously acknowledging the sanctity of the Red Cross. Without his Red Cross identification, he was shot and killed. The origins of the sanctity of the Red Cross in warfare are of enormous interest to ethicists and to really to sociologists in general. They probably range from the Benedictine Code of 1830 AD, where sanctuary was given to anybody who came to a monastery run by the Benedictines.
Right.
And then the medieval chivalry, the knights of chivalry, who once an opponent was knocked off his horse or his lance was lost, then was given quarter. There was no point in, once he was rendered, in the French term, hors de combat, there was no point in further destroying him. And even in Neolithic times, in pre-literate times, there is this concept of chivalry. It's believed, for example, amongst the Bedouin of North Africa, that if there was war between two Bedouin tribes, the victorious tribe would take all the sheep and all the women of the defeated tribe, kill all the men, often leaving one or two men. But as they left them, they would always leave their well rope with them, because dying from thirst, from lack of water, if one couldn't get the water out of the deep wells in the oasis there, was regarded as even worse than killing somebody. So there are these concepts of chivalry, of course, which saw their height in 1864 after Solferino, when Henri Dunant established the first Geneva Conventions, which gave sanctity to the Red Cross. And today, all our nurses, combat medics, our doctors, other healthcare professionals who are in operational service today wear the Red Cross. And they do that wonderfully if that gives them some protection in their duties, but it really is a manifestation of a higher code of ethics to which civilised people today would aspire to. Of course, in practice, as we saw in the atrocities of the Second World War particularly, that was often not observed. But the great tradition of Australian defence has been the scrupulous acknowledgement of the Red Cross and what it means. You mentioned, Ian, just about decorations, and you asked Robert and I just about those early doctors receiving decorations. Dr. A.G. Butler, paediatrician here in Brisbane, who was the first doctor ashore at Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915, in fact, was the first doctor, I think, to be awarded the Distinguished Service Order. And in the order of precedent, that comes after the Victoria Cross.
Right. Yes, please, Robert.
Can I
yes.
come back on the Red Cross armband? Yes. If you visit the War Memorial in Canberra, you will see on display there a Red Cross armband, which was, so it is said, worn by Simpson's donkey. And this was given to him by the commanding officer of his unit, because Simpson belonged to the 3rd Field Ambulance. And the commanding officer of the 3rd Field Ambulance was Alfred Sutton. Now, Alfred Sutton is a very famous Queenslander. He was born in England. He came out and settled in Queensland. I don't think he got a £10 assisted passage, but anyway, he set up practice first of all in Beenleigh, and then he moved to Brisbane. And he was the principal medical officer for the militia here right up until the First World War. He gave this armband to Simpson because he recognised that the work that he was doing with the donkey was really worthwhile, and he allowed him to go and work very much on his own, which was a pretty unusual thing. Sutton, of course, is also notable because he had two sons who also fought on the Western Front in World War One. So it's a family of three. They were all there together, and of his sons, the elder son, Neville, subsequently became the Professor of Surgery in the University of Queensland. And it's very significant when you look at the personalities who were at Gallipoli, how many of them were subsequently involved in the establishment of the Royal Australian College of Surgeons.
Why was that? Do you think their experience informed that afterwards?
Well, at that particular era, there were no formal qualifications for any specialty. You just acquired the skill, which is recognised, and you practised. But I think that what they learnt on the Western Front was the importance of training in surgery, and not just training, but actually formalising the training so that there was a curriculum, if you like, that people would follow that was appropriate. A tremendous amount was learnt during the 4 years of the war. The beginning of the war, what was done was basically fairly primitive. I mean, it was little more than dressing wounds and giving morphine and water. By the end of the war, there were very efficient surgical and resuscitation teams, which again were working far forward.
The highly skilled men came back after having that experience. Alfred Jeffress Turner was at the War Hospital in England, the Manor War Hospital, I believe, John. But he said, I think he said when he came back, he brought back a lot of skills with orthopaedics.
Yes, Alfred Jeffress Turner, as many knows, was the first superintendent, again I'm proud to say, of the then Hospital for Sick Children at the Royal Children's Hospital now, our own Royal Children's Hospital. He was an incredible man. It was he who in 1892 identified the syndrome of wasted, miserable children with increased intracranial pressure, with bulging nerves at the back of the eyes, and occasionally with foot and wrist drop, and sometimes a blue line across their mouth, and identified that as lead poisoning very correctly. And started with another wonderful doctored soldier, very famous doctor soldier from Queensland, John Lockhart Gibson. The two of them then led the great campaign, which over the ensuing 22 years ultimately led to the legislation banning lead paint on surfaces domestic surfaces below 8 feet in domestic homes. And that was an enormous step forward. But Alfred Jeffress Turner is, of course, revered as the founder of paediatrics in Australia, and certainly specifically here in Queensland. But he's known nationally, internationally, nothing to do with medicine, but as the nation's perhaps greatest lepidopterist. And his 40,000 insect collection, collected while he was at the Royal Children's Hospital in Brisbane, is today the basis of the national CSIRO insect collection in Canberra. And he described, it's thought, perhaps 20 to 30% of the Australian moth fauna in Australia. But he came back, as you correctly say, from the First World War, having served with the Brits.
Again,
Yes.
Butler was a paediatrician, yeah. Turner's a paediatrician, Gifford
Yes.
Kroll was a paediatrician, you're a paediatrician?
Yes.
What's the link?
Sidney Fancourt MacDonald was a paediatrician.
Yes.
He was the senior paediatrician in Australia, again from the Royal Children's Hospital here. And in the decade from the 1930 to 1940, his published papers on research and clinical discussions were the most published papers in the Medical Journal of Australia in that decade. He served in the First World War. He was the founder of the Melbourne University Rifles, now the Melbourne University Regiment. He came here to Brisbane. He had been born at what was then called Rocky Waterholes, Rocklea of today, and served for 37 years as the senior paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital. And Butler as well had the same tradition. You mentioned about Simpson before. We love to claim Simpson, of course, as very much an Australian, but Simpson was in Australia for a very short period of time, just a matter of 3 or 4 months. As you know, he was a ship stoker. He jumped ship in Fremantle, came around Australia as a stoker, tried coal mining in Cessnock. He then came here to Queensland and tried for somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks cane cutting at Mossman. But he found that, even as a stoker, found the incredible humidity and the heat of the North Queensland summer cane cutting too much. So went back and again jumped ship in Fremantle, joined the 3rd Field Ambulance and established the great datum and role model for much of military healthcare. So it's a great story.
It's a great story. Every individual we've mentioned is a great
Yes.
story by the sounds of it. It's
One
incredible.
often asks, what as a paediatrician,
Yes.
what is it in childhood that engenders a persona that will, for 33 days at Gallipoli, exposed himself to mortal risk every day? It's Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's believed that he brought to safety perhaps 300 wounded Australians every day for a month before he was finally killed under mortal risk. It's an incredible story, and I've walked in his footsteps in Newcastle upon Tyne. He was a Geordie, as I'm sure everybody knows, born in Tyne Gate under very impoverished circumstances. His folks, his mother wasn't married at a time when that was a problem socially. He, as a boy, left school at 11 and had a milk float with a much-loved horse, and joined the artillery. So he was, in Australia, he was a stretcher bearer, very famous stretcher bearer. He was a non-combatant, but he was not a pacifist.
Right.
He'd been a serving gunner as a 17-year-old boy in the medium howitzer regiment in South Shields on Tyneside at that time. But just to perhaps draw this little anecdote to an end, he grew up in an area, the church where he went with his mother every week is now gone, but the stained glass windows have been preserved in a museum in South Shields. And the feature there is a picture of the Good Samaritan. And what we would regard today as the lifeboat rescue service was also established in South Shields, and in the late 1700s, and the lifeboat memorial with a huge lifeboat with all the stories of courage and the saving of life is there today. So he saw that as a boy. So as he grew up, he was exposed to these concepts of courage, chivalry, bravery, and so on. One might speculate that perhaps led him to perform the way he did in this unbelievable way at Anzac.
Well, one of the other characters, Robert, one of the other medicos, Robert Huxtable, seemed to have a remarkable war. He was a GP at Charters Towers.
Yeah, one of the excuse me.
Yes, some water. We'll get some. We'll send a runner.
Robert will expand on that just in a moment when he's got his voice back. But Huxtable was one of the founders of military radiology, of course, because he'd been in the Boer War.
Right.
And then had come back. Röntgen had discovered X-rays in December 1896, and they were first used in warfare by the Italians in the Italo-Abyssinian War. But the Brits started off in the Boer War in 1899, not believing in radiology, but within a year or so realised that times had moved on, and X-rays of bones were crucially important in gunshot wounds.
There must have been this incredible exchange of information
Yes.
when the doctors all joined up over that.
So Huxtable went to the Boer War and brought back knowledge of military radiology with several other Queenslanders as well.
What I was going to say was, when you look at the doctors from Queensland who joined up in World War One, you realise that Queensland was a rather different sort of place. Maryborough was a big centre. A number of doctors from Maryborough joined and served in the war, and also Charters Towers, which of course includes Robert Huxtable, who He was medical superintendent of the hospital there for 20 years, and then another 10 years after that he was a consultant. And as John said, he was a pioneer of radiology, and he was one of the few GPs in Australia before the First World War who actually installed an X-ray apparatus in his rooms. But Huxtable wasn't just an innovator in that respect. He was a keen peacetime soldier, and he didn't serve in the medical corps initially. He served in the Kennedy Regiment, of which he became the commanding officer. The Kennedy Regiment was has now morphed into the 31st Battalion of the Royal Queensland Regiment. Thank you very much. And when war broke out in 1914, Huxtable decided not to wait for orders, but he commandeered a ship that happened to be in the port at Townsville, and he put his battalion on the ship and took them to Thursday Island, because in the planning for the defence of Australia, the role of his battalion was to man Thursday Island and protect it from any German attacks. It was then decided that they would call for volunteers from this battalion to make up the 2nd Battalion for the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, which was going to Rabaul. And 500 of them volunteered, and they set off to Port Moresby. Unfortunately, there were two problems. First of all, most of these young militia soldiers were inadequately equipped and probably poorly trained. And secondly, the stokers on the ship had not volunteered for going to a war zone, so they went on strike. And the ship made Port Moresby because some of these keen young men said that they would stoke the ship and get it there. But when it arrived in Port Moresby, it was decided that this was actually not going to be a successful enterprise, so the ship returned to Townsville. Huxtable subsequently transferred to the Medical Corps, and he went to Gallipoli as the commanding officer of the 5th Field Ambulance, and then he went to the Western Front, where he was the Assistant Director of Medical Services for the 2nd Division until the end of the war.
How old was he? How old was Huxtable at that stage?
I can give you a definitive answer, but only by checking the book.
Because he died in the 1920s, I'm wondering whether it was...
He had, as far as we know, he had suffered from viral hepatitis, and he clearly developed some form of cirrhosis of the liver,
Right.
and died, yes, in the early 1920s, but I think relatively young, let's say about 50.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of those doctor soldiers that went were relatively old compared with the medics and the stretcher bearers that they were commanding. For example, A.G. Butler, the great hero from here in Brisbane, when the First World War broke out, he was 42, had a child, and it was very interesting that he, in the camp here at Enoggera, army camp, being a relatively old man, compared with all the 17-year-olds and some of the 15 and 16-year-olds who put their ages up. He was very meticulous and got the nickname Gertie because they thought he was a bit of an old woman in his meticulous attention to detail, which of course served them very well subsequently at Anzac Cove.
Now we're running out of time, and there are a number of people, but I wanted to mention Kroll, and we were talking about Turner before, one of his colleagues. And Turner was much older. I think Turner was in his 50s when he served in England. One of his colleagues was David Gifford Kroll. And Kroll's papers are over there as well. And Kroll served in both World Wars, and he wrote Turner's obituary. But what was Kroll's experience in the war? He was at Gallipoli, but he then served in Palestine as well.
Well,
John,
yes.
is that right?
Well, Gifford Kroll's a very important person in the history of Queensland medicine, not only in military medicine. He lived at Sherwood and Corinda on the river there. He was very keen scout. He was keen in the early Sea Scouts from 1908 there at Corinda and Sherwood in Brisbane. He had a beautiful boat which he called Marion after his wife. But the importance from the point of view of medicine is that he established the first pathology laboratory, as we would understand that term, in Queensland in 1909, again at the Hospital for Sick Children. And the laboratory that he set up there, which had a very important function in blood counts, which had come in the 1880s, sedimentation counts, which had come in the 1890s, and Pasteur's microbiology, which had really first been identified by Pasteur in 1882. Over the ensuing 2 or 3 decades, Ifford Kroll here in Brisbane, locally here, established a service of pathology which served from 1909 all the hospitals which are on the site at the quarries of the Hurston Hospital campus. That was the Brisbane Hospital, the Hospital for Sick Children, the Infectious Diseases Hospital, which were all there. And the Kroll precinct, which is now established by the Brisbane City Council at Corinda, recognises his service as an ongoing tribute to what he did.
And another paediatrician?
Oh, absolutely.
And an
yes.
entomologist like Turner, and yourself?
Innovation goes on all the time, and we have in the audience here tonight 2 very close friends, 2 very senior colleagues in the health services generally. Colonel George Carney is here with us tonight, former Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University, and George invented a culture-free intelligence test applied for recruiting for those individuals, particularly when prior to 1975, when we were recruiting in Papua New Guinea, which would bypass the differences in education and the scoring that's so important in selecting recruits. And we have also with us Group Captain George Merridew, who's visiting from Launceston for tonight here with us. And it was George who has done so much in highlighting the importance of simple anaesthetic apparatus on overseas deployments as well. So this tradition of enterprise, of innovation by these people is very much alive and well and continuing today.
And the 2 of you have served overseas. Your experience where you served in Rwanda and various other places, has that given you a greater appreciation of the work of these men a century ago and the remarkable frontline work in not just in war but in medicine that they where they were, that what they managed to achieve? But your experience overseas, is that part of the reason why you're so interested, I guess, in these men who served 100 years ago, these doctors? Robert?
One of the things that you do experience going on operations overseas is the having to deal with casualties as they occur, which may be individually or in large numbers. You also have to do the best you can at the time. Doesn't mean that you can actually give first-class Australian service to everybody all the time. You have to do the best you can. And I think that one of the reasons why so many of the doctors from World War I suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress was because of feelings of guilt associated with acts of omission on the battlefield. When I say acts of omission, I mean the failure to save life that could have been saved if the circumstances had been different or the location somewhere else. And I think that was probably one of the hardest things that they had to face, the totally depressing environment in which there were every day dozens and dozens of people who were beyond help or for whom little could be done.
were there many, you mentioned S.P. Dodd hung himself sometime later. Amongst the doctors, I know that post-traumatic stress was responsible for many people dying after the war, but were there many cases amongst doctors? I mean, how badly were they affected?
Well, it's difficult to get accurate figures because in that era, suicide was considered very shameful and was often hushed up. And as in the case of Dodds, no inquest was held. But in writing my books on the biographies of the doctors, I have identified 15 doctors, certainly, who committed suicide. Now, some of those committed suicide during the war, some of them 10 years after, and some of them 30 years after. Now, those who died 30 years after, we can discount them because they were probably due to chronic illness or psychiatric illness and not relevant to the war. But two of the doctors from Gallipoli shot themselves in Egypt when they came back from Gallipoli. One of them, Joseph Buchanan, was he was a GP here from Brisbane. One doesn't have any explanation for this, but there must have been some obviously personal, pressing, compelling feeling of guilt or shame or inadequacy. Another one jumped overboard from the troop ship on the way home after the war was over. One can't really explain this, but when you reckon that there were about 1,300 Australian doctors serving on the Western Front during the war, for the whole of the war, and if 15 committed suicide, that's less than 1%, which is a lower risk than the Queensland suicide register at the Griffith University tells you is usual for doctors. How many actually suffer from PTSD? Well, we don't really know, but there are many cases that you will find if you look through the book of people who spent months or even years in mental institutions, and many of them never practiced again. They're the casualties of war among the medical profession. And nowadays we're much more aware of the situation, much more alert to this. But then everyone wanted to cover it up, so I don't think we ever really will know.
And we've jumped around a bit, but does anybody have any questions? We've got a microphone at the back wandering around if anybody wants to put up their hand and ask anything. John, the doctors, it was in spite of the toll it took on them as well. They must have brought, as we mentioned at the start, quite a range of skills back. Is there anything that stands out as something that came from the war that helped Queensland that the doctors brought back?
Yes, Ian, indeed. I mean, radiology was a very good example. The management of exsanguination of blood and the need for blood replacement, as it's been practiced since these times, of course, had its origins in the response to the military. In more recent times, most of the trauma centres in the Western world today really are centred on the lessons that were learned in Vietnam and the big trauma, especially trauma hospitals that have been set up, for example, in Europe, in Germany, in Britain, in Birmingham, for example, and the trauma centres that are set up in big centres, these specialised acute centres like those, for example, at Princess Alexandra Hospital and Royal Brisbane Hospital here in Brisbane, really have their origins from the lessons learnt with the management of catastrophic trauma really from Vietnam. We've learnt many other lessons, the lessons of preventive medicine, which are most important of all in military medicine, not the acute response to acute trauma, but in fact keeping troops healthy and alive, and out of danger, both from shot and shell, but also from infectious diseases, is very, very, very important indeed. And those lessons have come particularly from military experimentation. For example, the work of our Army Malaria Institute, which is centred today at Nogra, on the Atherton Tablelands and in Cairns from 1943, really established the clinical doctrine for the prevention of clinical malaria. One of the key doctors working in that unit, Josephine McKerris, a Sydney graduate but from here in Brisbane, had refused an MBE, even although the Director General of Medical Services, in submitting her name after the war for recognition, had put on the submission the words, "No other woman has contributed more with greater effect for the successful outcome of the Allied war effort." Because she didn't serve overseas, she was denied that recognition.
Right. Any questions? Yes? Just over here. Yeah.
I was wondering, could you make some comment about the contribution of nurses to
Well, we were talking about doctors, but of course, yeah, nurses. Yes, I mean, obviously, nurses is another almost genre.
Yes, well, we have the tradition of military nursing here in Queensland is very, very strong, as we all know, really dating from the Boer War, of course. There are at least 5 Queensland nurses who went, and their stories have been told and have been published with very, very proud identification of those first steps in military nursing as a specialised profession in its own right. The nurses in the Second World War are very rightly being identified these months in film and in documentaries. The most famous Australian, as recorded in the Gallup poll published in the New York Times, was Sister Elizabeth Kenny, who was the nurse on the ships that returned surviving, injured, convalescent soldiers back from the Middle East to Australia. As an example, not of a clinical nurse, as we would understand it in war, but as another escort nurse. And of course, she's known as Sister Kenny, Elizabeth Kenny, the sister referring to her military rank as sister. So there are many facets to the history of military nursing, of which Queensland is very proud.
We have time for another question if anybody wants to ask one. I noticed that Kroll served with the Camel Field Ambulance in Palestine. The Camel Field Ambulance.
Yes, these were wonderful field ambulances, and within the presence of the Marx family here tonight, as a young captain, regimental medical officer, I had to learn about is it, Robert, correctly, the cachalets that the camels drag behind them as a V-shaped wooden structure attached to the back of the camel, the two ends of the spikes running along in the sand.
Oh no, that's not the cachalet, Ron. The cachalet is a sort of yes, like a seesaw that
Travoirs
fitted onto the camel. I mean, riding a camel must be pretty awful anyway. But if you're wounded and you're being bounced up and down as you go, the dragging cart version was obviously much more comfortable for the casualties.
It was called a travois. I can remember Charles Ferdinand Marx Jr. giving us a lecture once on travoirs.
The campaign in the desert, of course, was quite different from the Western Front in that it was much more of a fluid war. And it was very important, of course, for the medical services to keep up with the light horsemen. and they actually had a mobile operating theatre set up, which would, as I say, keep up with the advancing troops so that they could actually treat them nearer the front. And they were certainly into experimentation there too. I mean, one of the big problems with casualties in World War I were abdominal wounds. Difficult to deal with surgically at the best of times, but in the pre-antibiotic era, very few people with major abdominal wounds would have survived. And in order to perfect their skills, Kroll had them round up some of these horrible old wild dogs in the desert, and they anaesthetised them and then shot them in the abdomen and then performed surgical procedures in order to see the best way of dealing with soldiers who had abdominal wounds. So they're even in the front line, they were looking at ways of providing a better service to the soldiers.
Oh, that's an incredible story. Yes, John?
The survival rate from penetrating wounds, shrapnel or bullet wounds to the head in the First World War was only 9%. And in the Second World War, another Australian, Sir Hugh Cairns, a neurosurgeon from Adelaide, established at St Hugh's College, Women's College in Oxford, a centre for the treatment of penetrating wounds of the head, at the same time as his other colleague, Florey, also from Adelaide, had first brought in penicillin. And by 1944, the survival rate of penetrating wounds to the head from bullets was 91%, an incredible increase. The other thing that Sir Hugh Cairns did was he insisted that these dispatch riders wear helmets, because he was treating so many wounds as a neurosurgeon from motorcyclists that had accidents. And that was, in fact, the first in the chronology of the push for motorcycle helmets and subsequently bicycle helmets in Oxford in 1943.
Well, you can see why these fellows have written 20 books between them. There's so much to talk about and probably so many more books to write. Look, we've run out of time. There are plenty of items over there of interest on the tables from these various remarkable people and families. Please thank with me Dr. Robert Likeman and Dr. John Pearn. We'll stick around for a bit if you want to come over and ask some questions, but otherwise have a look at the material over there. This is the last night in the John Oxley Library for this year, but hopefully it'll be back next year. Thank you very much for coming.